Most evil is recognizable. It has a face you can hate, it makes noise, it breaks things in ways that leave evidence, blood, rubble, smoke still rising from what used to be standing. You can point at it, you can name it, and more importantly, you can survive it and know what you survived. But there is another kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself through ugliness, the kind that walks in wearing grandeur like a coat, that looks you in the eye and speaks with something that sounds exactly like wisdom. That doesn't shatter you, it edits you, quietly, precisely. And when it's done, you won't know anything has changed because what changed was the story you tell yourself about who you are. That's the kind of evil we need to talk about. Not the obvious horrors of Tolkien's world. Not the orc armies or the drowning of Númenor or the long, grinding centuries of Morgoth's war against anything that grew or shone or lived. Those are catastrophes, yes, world-ending ones, the kind of evil that bends entire ages of history out of shape. But this is different in kind, not just scale. What we're going to trace is what happens when the most sophisticated intelligence in the history of a world, one that cannot create but has perfected corruption to an art form, takes something magnificent and doesn't break it, doesn't ruin it, doesn't strip it of its gifts or its beauty or its power. Just points all of it at ruin. We're talking about the dragons. Tolkien loved them the way a man loves a thing he spent his whole life studying, not comfortably, not safely, but with the deep and unsettled admiration of someone who knows exactly how dangerous the subject is and has never been able to look away. He built them into his mythology with the precision of a scholar and the care of a man who feared them. Every serpent, every firedrake, every winged catastrophe. From the first spark in the darkest age of the world to the last great fire going cold above a northern lake on an autumn evening the Third Age would never forget. We're going to understand all of it. Settle in close, this one burns. To understand what the dragons are you have to understand who made them. And to understand that, you have to go back before the world existed. Back to music, back to void, back to the moment when a mind that should have been the greatest creative intelligence ever brought into being made the one choice that broke everything it could have become. His name was Melkor. He who arises in might, not ironic when it was given. Melkor was the most powerful of the Aenir, those divine spirits through whose collective voice Ilúvatar sang existence into being. He had the widest reach, the deepest resonance, every theme in the music of creation Melkor could touch, every chord the others could only approach from outside, he could enter from within. He was the most gifted thing that had ever existed. And he couldn't stand it. Not the gifts he loved. What he couldn't stand was the fact that they were given, that his power, enormous as it was, came from somewhere else, that there existed a creative fire he hadn't earned, hadn't generated, hadn't seized for himself. A flame called the secret fire, the flame imperishable, the source of Ilúvatar's own originating power. He went looking for it. This is where everything starts. Melkor moved into the void between the themes of creation, away from the music that was his nature, away from the company of his kind, hunting something in the dark that would make his power his own asterisk. Something that would let him make things from nothing, without debt, without relationship, without the fundamental humility that genuine creativity apparently demands. He never found it. You cannot find the secret fire with that intention. The desire itself is the disqualification. It's not a resource to be seized, it's not a treasure in a chest somewhere in the void. And hunting it with hungry hands in the cold and dark doesn't bring you closer to it, it just teaches your hands to take. What Melkor found instead, moving through uncreated space for ages beyond counting, was a different capacity. Not making but unmaking, not creating but corrupting. He learned in the long cold solitude of his searching to take what existed and bend it backward, to hollow things out, to take what was good and find the exact angle from which to turn it against itself. When the world was finally made and Melkor descended into it, he carried all of that accumulated expertise with him. He made orcs from captured elves, twisted and tormented into shapes built for war and nothing else. He made trolls as a mockery of Ents, living stone that could kill but couldn't grow. He wrapped willing Maiar in shadow and fire until whatever they'd been was no longer reachable and called them Balrogs. Everything he touched he corrupted, and he touched everything he could. Then, in the underground fortress of Utumno and later in the Iron Mountains of Angband, he made the first dragons. What he started with, what raw material he took and transformed, Tolkien deliberately never says. That silence is intentional. The origins of orcs are established. The troll's mockery is confirmed, but the dragon's source material stays unnamed, and that namelessness matters. What we can infer from everything Tolkien understood about how Morgoth's power worked: they weren't made from nothing because Morgoth couldn't make from nothing. They were made from something, something taken, something changed, something that retained in its altered form the intelligence and the magnificence and the specific pride of whatever it had been before. And they were made in fire. Not combustion, not fuel plus air plus heat. The fire Morgoth worked in the depths of Angband came from volcanic sources, from the heat at the center of the earth placed there by the shaping of the world, fire with intention in it, fire that wasn't a process but a nature. Dragons don't breathe fire because they have some biological mechanism that produces it. They breathe fire because fire is what they are it's their substance, what Morgoth poured into them when he made them. The fire is not their weapon. The fire is their self. The first dragon was Glaurung. He didn't arrive with fanfare, he didn't burst through the gates of Angband in a blaze of obvious apocalypse. He crawled out, not walked, not flew, crawled in the year 260 of the First Age, and he wasn't yet full grown. Fingon's elves drove him back with spears and arrows. He retreated underground. Sit with that for a moment. The first dragon in the history of the world was turned back by ordinary elvish soldiers with ordinary weapons. He was young, incomplete. A first attempt. Morgoth was still learning what he'd built, still discovering what the creature could become. But even in that first incomplete emergence, something was already present that no other weapon Morgoth had ever made possessed. Something that announced itself not in physical terror but in behavior. Glaurung chose his moment. He emerged without warning, at a time that caught the elves off balance. He understood the value of surprise. He planned. An orc doesn't plan, an orc fights and destroys because that's what its nature pushes it toward. Glaurung made choices, weighed timing, calculated effect. And then he retreated underground and did not emerge again for 200 years. Not because he was wounded, not because he was afraid. 200 years of lying in the dark while the wars of the First Age continued above him, while Fingolfin led the Noldor, while heroes were born and aged and died, while the siege of Angband was mounted and maintained, while the world changed in all the ways that would determine the context of what he would eventually become. Glaurung grew. In 455 he came back, full grown, and everything had changed. He crossed the plain of Ardgalen at the head of Morgoth's assault in what elvish memory would call the Dagger Bragalach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. And what he did to the defenders wasn't simply a matter of being too large to fight or too fast to escape. It was that he changed what combat meant. He crossed the fields and the fields burned, not because he breathed fire at them deliberately, because of what he was. A living furnace moving across dry grass, his body radiating enough heat to set alight everything within a radius that made the concept of a defensive line absurd. Fortifications failed, not because he battered them down, but because stone heated to sufficient temperature cracks, and men cannot stand at walls that are trying to kill them. And the whole physical logic of a fortified position assumes the attacker is on the other side of the wall rather than making the wall itself into a weapon. But the fire is not the most important thing about Glaurung. The fire is obvious. The fire is what fills your immediate awareness with the most urgent possible demand for response. It's what most accounts of him stop at. The most important thing about Glaurung is his mind. He was called Father of Dragons not merely because he was first, but because his intelligence was something genuinely different in kind from every other weapon Morgoth had ever made. He thought in the long strategic mode of a creature for whom a century wasn't a long time, who had nothing to spend his attention on except whatever problem he chose to give it, who brought to the study of human weakness the specific insight of a mind built by the darkest and most perceptive intelligence in the world. He could look at a person and know things. Not the vague reading of body language that any experienced soldier develops. The precise, penetrating knowledge of something that could identify what a person most feared, what they most desperately wanted, where their confidence was thinnest, and exactly how each of those points could be used against them. This faculty had a name. The dragon spell. This is the most psychologically precise and genuinely disturbing thing in Tolkien's entire dragon mythology. Understanding it changes how you read every encounter between a dragon and a human being in the whole legendarium. It is not optional context, it's the key. When Glaurung fixed his gaze on you directly, something happened in your mind that was not quite paralysis and not quite compulsion but both simultaneously. You couldn't move unless he allowed movement. You couldn't form thoughts in any organized or useful way. And into the space where your thoughts had been, Glaurung placed his not as a foreign voice speaking in your head but as your own memories, your own conclusions, beliefs you apparently worked out yourself through your own reasoning over your own lifetime. He wasn't reading minds. He was writing them, replacing what was there with what he chose to put there. The past he described became the past you remembered. His reading of your character became the reading you held of yourself. His prediction of your future became the future you believed was inevitable. Now here's what most analyzers miss. The worst part of the dragon spell is not what it does while it's happening. The worst part is what it leaves behind after it ends. When you escaped Glaurung's direct gaze, the compulsion released, the paralysis lifted. You could move and think and act again. You were free of the spell in the sense that its active application was withdrawn, but the beliefs he'd installed didn't leave with it. They persisted not as foreign objects in your memory, not as things you could identify as having been placed there. They persisted as memories. As things you believed you had concluded yourself through your own faculties at some prior point in your life. The dragon spell doesn't leave its victims knowing they were manipulated. It leaves them with a distorted autobiography they will carry forward and act on as if it were entirely their own. Tolkien, who was a scholar of the way language and story shape how human beings understand themselves, understood what this meant at a profound level. The worst damage that can be done to a person is not physical. It's not even the pain of loss, though loss is terrible. The worst damage is to the story a person tells about who they are. To get inside that story and rewrite the central chapters, not in a way the person can detect and reject, but in a way that integrates seamlessly with everything else they believe, so that when the external force is withdrawn, the damage continues running from inside, using the person's own intelligence and memory and reasoning capacity as weapons against themselves. This is exactly what Glaurung did to Turin. Turin's story is one of the great tragedies of the First Age. He was brilliant, brave, capable of extraordinary things, and genuinely cursed, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but cosmologically cursed by a curse Morgoth himself had laid on his father Hurin as punishment for Hurin's defiance. The curse was real. It bent probability against him. It arranged circumstances to produce the worst possible outcome at every critical junction. And Glaurung found him, repeatedly, at the moments of maximum vulnerability, the exact junctions where Turin's grief and guilt and pride were most accessible to being used. The moments Glaurung had been watching and waiting for. Nargothrond, when Glaurung broke the bridge in the Elven Kingdom's last defense, crumbled. He turned his gaze on Turin and told him things that weren't entirely lies. This is critical. The dragon spell doesn't work primarily through falsehood. It works through the selective amplification of truth, taking what is actually present in a person and arranging it to produce the worst possible reading. Turin's pride was real. His failures were real. The grief he carried was genuinely his. Glaurung took those real things and arranged them into a narrative in which they were all that was real, in which every other consideration was swallowed by them, in which the only available conclusion was the most damaging one. Turin stood frozen while the elves who had followed him were marched into slavery. And when he broke free of the spell, what he carried forward wasn't just grief and guilt, it was a dragon-written self-image. A particular version of himself that he hadn't chosen and couldn't detect and would act on as if it had always been his. Glaurung didn't need to be present for most of the destruction that followed. He'd done his work, and the work ran independently, using Turin's own mind as the engine. This is what made the First Age dragons categorically different from armies. An army destroys what it encounters and stops when it moves on. A dragon destroys what it touches, and then the thing it touched becomes a vehicle of further destruction, carrying the damage outward through every subsequent relationship, every choice, every action that flows from the broken self-story. The dragon is not a weapon. It's a multiplier. It creates self-sustaining harm. It weaponizes the person against themselves, against their loves, against everything they would otherwise have built. And then it waits to see how far the damage travels. When most people picture dragons, they picture fire and wings. Both exist in Tolkien's world. But the full picture is more complex than that, and the complexity matters for understanding how the dragon lineage developed across the ages. The first distinction, fire drakes and cold drakes. Fire drakes breathe fire, cold drakes do not. They are, if not the older form, at least the parallel form, the variety that persisted in the cold northern regions where Morgoth's influence was most concentrated, and where fire was less useful than pure physical mass and the specific cold embedded in the furthest north. Cold drakes are still enormous, still intelligent, still patient, still armored, still capable of the long strategic thinking all great dragons share. Their weapon is simply their body, the crushing weight of them, the ancient cold radiating from creatures made in the uttermost north, the fact of being the largest and strongest and most patient thing in any territory they choose to occupy. They survived longer than most people realize. They persisted into the Third Age in the Grey Mountains, those cold northern peaks that the dwarves attempted to resettle in the 29th century of that age. The dwarves found the geological richness they were looking for. They also found neighbors. Dragons had been accumulating in the Grey Mountains across the long centuries, drifting into territory where they were unchallenged, where there was enough of what they wanted: solitude, silence, and eventually the gold that a rebuilding dwarven civilization would bring. The outcome was predictable. Over roughly a century, escalating from isolated attacks to sustained pressure to outright assault, the Grey Mountain settlements became uninhabitable. The last great cold drake attack killed Danae and sent Thror and the remnant of his people south, which is why Thror eventually arrives at Erebor, which is why Smaug's attack on Erebor is the specific disaster that it is, which is why Gandalf eventually knocks on the door of Bag End. Cold drakes are historical background. They don't have names that echo through ages, but they shaped the Third Age in ways that led, step by step, directly to everything. The second distinction: wingless and winged fire drakes. Glaurung was wingless. This surprises people who imagine all great dragons in flight. He was immense, fire-breathing, capable of crossing vast distances at a speed his physical scale made feel impossible, but he crawled. He was a ground weapon, a siege engine of living fire. Winged fire drakes came later. A deliberate escalation. The addition of flight to the existing terror of the fire drake removed the last remaining tactical advantage any defender could maintain. You can prepare a fortification against a ground assault. You can account for a creature that must approach through terrain. You cannot fortify against something that flies over whatever you built. The greatest of the winged fire drakes was Ankalagan the Black. Ankalagan was not a creature that happened to be available when the final confrontation arrived. He was made for it. The War of Wrath, the valor descending from Valinor at last, after long ages of prayer and intercession, their armies advancing through Beleriand toward Angband itself. Morgoth, watching the host of the west approaching, made Ankalagan as his answer. Not an answer, the answer. The single creature Morgoth believed represented sufficient power to turn a battle being fought against divine forces. When Morgoth released his dragons, every fire drake and cold drake and winged serpent accumulated across the entire First Age. Ankalagan flew at their head. Eärendil was in the sky. The mariner who had crossed the shadowy seas and pled the case of the children of Iluvatar before the valor, the last Silmaril burning on his brow, was sailing above the dying world in his flying ship Vingalot. Manwë sent the eagles, not a detachment, not a patrol. The eagles of the Lord of the West, every great spirit that had taken that form, rising from every high peak, coming on wings that had never known age or diminishment. Eärendil led them. The battle that followed lasted a day and a night and into the second dawn. Let that sit. The sun went down, it came back up, and still it continued. The greatest aerial engagement in the history of the world, fought between the winged fire drakes of Morgoth and the eagles of Manwë, with one man carrying starlight against the largest creature ever made. Ankalagan fell. Eärendil cast him down. And when he fell, this is the detail Tolkien includes with the quiet precision of a chronicler who trusts you to feel the scale. When Ankalagan's body struck the peaks of Thangorodrim, they broke. Thangorodrim, the three volcanic peaks Morgoth had raised over Angband by the direct application of his own divine power. The highest mountains in the world, raised by a being who had once been comparable to Manwë himself, reinforced across centuries of his sustained attention. They were not ordinary mountains. They were a statement of will made into stone. They broke when Ankalagan hit them. Now hold that image and reverse it. If the dead weight falling could do that, if the corpse of the creature could shatter Thangorodrim, what did the living creature represent? What was the force that inhabited that body when it was alive, moving with intent, burning, being what Ankalagan was at the full expression of his existence? There is no military language for this, No siege engine comparison that works. No scale of force that adequately represents what an alive Ankalagan in flight was asterisk as a presence in the physical world. The only answer to him was Eärendil with a Silmaril and the Eagles of Manwë. Which means the only answer to him was direct divine intervention, operating at a scale entirely outside anything mortal civilization could plan for or prepare against. With Ankalagan's fall, the war ended, Beleriand sank beneath the sea, Morgoth was thrown into the outer void, the dragons of the elder days ended, most of them with the age that made them. Most not all. The destruction of Beleriand did not exterminate every dragon. The greatest ones didn't survive. No winged fire drakes of Ankalagan's order are recorded in the Second Age, but cold drakes and some of the lesser fire drakes went elsewhere, north and east into the vast wildernesses that the war hadn't fully reached. They went to places large enough, cold enough, and empty enough that creatures of great age could lie dormant without being disturbed. Dragons don't need to be active to be alive. They don't age the way mortal things age. They don't require constant nourishment or movement or engagement. They can lie still for decades, for centuries, consuming their own stored heat and whatever occasionally wanders within reach and simply wait, not impatiently, not with suffering. They wait the way mountains wait as an untroubled given state, the natural resting mode of a creature for whom time operates at a fundamentally different scale than it does for you. The Second Age passed. Sauron rose as the primary darkness. The rings were forged. The elves were deceived. Numenor was drowned. The last alliance fought on the slopes of Orodruin. The dragons existed through all of it as background, known, feared, occasionally encountered by those unlucky enough to enter their territory, but not the central story of that age. They were creatures that had outlived their era. Scatha the Worm was the most notable dragon of the early Third Age, a cold drake in the Grey Mountains, powerful enough to have accumulated significant treasure and established himself as a serious regional threat. Fram of the Eotheod killed him, making his reputation in the way that killing a great worm always makes a reputation. It also produced the treasure dispute with the Dwarves, who claimed Scatha's hoard as rightfully theirs since the dragon had taken it from them. That may have eventually contributed to Fram's death. But the Grey Mountains were where the real Third Age dragon story was building, and it ended in the forced migration that led to Thror, which led to Erebor, which led to Smaug. Before we arrive at Smaug, we need to stop at the Horde. Because the Horde is not peripheral to dragon nature. It's not a secondary characteristic, a curious behavioral detail, a convenient premise for treasure hunt narratives. The Horde is central to what dragons are, and Tolkien understood this at a depth that almost no one else who has ever written about dragons has managed to reach. Everyone knows dragons want gold. It's the first thing you learn. And because it's first and because it's so consistent across the whole tradition, it tends to get treated as the least interesting thing, accepted as a given, not examined, moved past quickly on the way to the actual story. This is a mistake. The desire for gold is not simple. It's not like a predator's desire for prey, functional, instrumental, the prey providing nourishment that sustains life. Gold does not nourish a dragon. It doesn't enhance their strength or fire or armor in any documentable way. A dragon lying on an enormous pile of gold is not physically superior to a dragon lying on bare stone. The gold doesn't do anything. And the dragon desires it with an intensity that exceeds any functional explanation. What it does is this: it completes something in the dragon's self-conception. A dragon without a horde is existentially uncomfortable in the specific way that an artist without work is uncomfortable, not physically damaged, not suffering in any obvious sense, but incomplete. The horde is the external correlate of the dragon's sense of its own magnitude, the material evidence of what the dragon is. A horde as great as Glaurung's reflected Glaurung. A horde as magnificent as Smaug's reflected, and was required by Smaug's sense of himself. The horde is the dragon's autobiography, written in gold and gems and the accumulated treasures of peoples who couldn't keep them. And the dragon knows every piece of it. This is one of the most specific and psychologically precise things Tolkien built into dragon lore. A dragon knows its horde the way you know the geography of a room you've lived in for years, not by consciously counting or cataloging, but through a constant background perfect awareness. The absence of any single piece is felt immediately, with the specific and intensifying irritation of something that is both wrong and an asterisk affront. Smaug was asleep when Bilbo took the cup. He woke in the dark, And before anything else, before the anger, before any assessment of the situation, before any of the responses a creature in his position might move toward, he ran the census. Not deliberately. By the dragon's specific faculty that tracked the horde the way your nervous system tracks the position of your own body. And he felt the cup's absence the way you feel the absence of a tooth. Immediately, specifically, with a sense of violation that doesn't diminish as you think about it. This is not about the cup's value. In the context of Smaug's hoard, the greatest treasure in the Third Age, representing the accumulated output of an entire civilization, one cup is nothing. Financially, economically, by any external measure, the loss is meaningless. But the theft was an act against the completeness of the hoard. And the completeness of the hoard is the dragon's self-image. Someone took from you and was not immediately destroyed for the presumption. That is the challenge, not to the cup's value, to the proposition that Smaug was inviolable. This is why dragons who are robbed don't simply replace what was taken. They burn cities, they destroy countryside, they make the region pay a cost so catastrophically disproportionate to the stolen object that the disproportion itself becomes the message that the category of taking from a dragon does not exist as a sustainable act. The response is not about the object. The response is about the asterisk story. A dragon lying dormant on its hoard for 100 years is not sleeping. It's thinking. Slowly, in the long cycles that a creature of that age and metabolic pace uses to think, but with a depth and continuity that shorter-lived minds cannot match, because the dragon has no interruptions, no distractions, no urgencies that redirect its attention. Its thought runs long and unbroken, returning to the same subjects across years, working over the same material with the patient thoroughness of something that has all the time in the world for whatever it decides to consider. What does it think about? Primarily itself. A dragon's interior life, inferred from the few recorded conversations between dragons and humans who survived long enough to report them, is organized around the dragon's own history. Its victories, its treasures, its enemies defeated, its power demonstrated, the specific quality and extent of its own magnificence. This sounds like simple vanity. In one sense it is. But it's vanity of such duration and depth that it has taken on a different character from what vanity ordinarily means. Ordinary vanity is fragile, it requires external reinforcement, it bruises easily, it's defensive because it's not quite certain of itself. Dragon vanity is structural asterisk. The settled certainty of something that has been the apex predator of any environment it has ever occupied for so long that the certainty has become a given, not maintained by effort, not defended, not even quite conscious. Just the unexamined foundation of how the dragon understands itself and its place in the order of things. You cannot shake it by being honest. You cannot convince a dragon that it has overestimated itself. The assessment is not wrong in the ways you might challenge it. Smaug knew what he was the greatest creature in the Third Age. This was not self-delusion, it was simply accurate. The danger this creates in conversation is the danger of mistaking structural certainty for the kind of ego that can be manipulated. Flattery works on a dragon in the sense that a dragon told of its own magnificence will often become expansive, more inclined toward the theatrical self-presentation that is its natural mode in the presence of an audience. Bilbo used this. He confirmed Smaug's self-assessment and Smaug opened up. But the dragon is not being fooled. It knows the flattery is flattery. It doesn't care because the flattery is correct asterisk. Being told true things about your magnificence by something you consider too small to constitute a real threat is just an unusual form of entertainment. You let it continue because you can end it whenever you choose and because, after 171 years of silence, even a burglar is an audience. Here's where it gets dangerous, in ways the dragon doesn't fully account for. The dragon's confidence in its own invulnerability is structural but not total. There is one gap in it, the one place that hasn't been examined, the one part of the armor it has never actually verified, the one detail its settled certainty has excluded from consideration because the certainty itself was the reason it was never looked at. When the dragon performs its magnificence for an audience, it performs toward that gap. Not consciously, not as a mistake a more careful dragon would avoid, but as the natural consequence of the fact that the weakness is adjacent to the pride. Smaug showed Bilbo his chest. He showed it not to reveal the weakness but to demonstrate the armor's perfection, to show that even the underside, usually the vulnerable surface, was covered. The bare patch was not something he was displaying. It was something he had forgotten to look at, because his certainty that there was no weakness had prevented him from conducting the inspection that might have found it. He showed the wrong thing to the wrong creature at the wrong moment. And it killed him. All the great dragons speak. Not in grunts or growls or the biological signaling of a dangerous animal. In the languages of men and elves with full vocabulary and complex syntax and the capacity for elaborate argumentation and layered deception. They can construct a narrative, build an argument over the course of a conversation that leads you, step by apparently reasonable step, to a conclusion that serves them and destroys you. They can tell you things that are technically true in every verifiable particular while the overall impression they create is precise falsehood. Why? A dragon doesn't need language to survive, doesn't need to negotiate. The fire and the armor and the scale are more than sufficient for any material purpose. Language is not necessary, it could not have been selected for survival in any normal sense. It's there because it was put there, deliberately, by the intelligence that designed the dragon. Morgoth put it there because he'd studied the children of Iluvatar long enough to understand something fundamental. The most complete form of domination over beings with language and intelligence and self-reflection is not physical, it's psychological. You can destroy a city with fire, but you can destroy a civilization not by burning it but by talking to it. By speaking into it the specific version of reality that benefits you and watching it reorganize itself around that version until it has done your work for you. The fire ends things. The words bend them. Morgoth wanted weapons that did what he did, not merely destroyed but corrupted. Not merely killed but distorted. Dragons that could speak were dragons that could do what Morgoth did to the entire world, but in miniature, in individual lives, with the specific precision of a mind that understood exactly who it was talking to and knew which words would do the most work. There's also a theological dimension here that Tolkien understood deeply and almost never stated explicitly but embedded in everything he built. Tolkien believed in the metaphysical power of language, not as metaphor, as ontological fact. In his mythology, the elves named things into their fullness of being. The great powers spoke things into existence. The music of the Aenir was the world before the world was made. Language, in Tolkien's understanding, participates in the reality of what it describes. To name something truly is to touch something real about it. The dragon's speech is this gift, inverted. It uses language not to name things into their fullness but to speak them into diminishment. To take the most powerful creative capacity the children of Iluvatar possess, the capacity that makes civilization possible, that makes art and law and relationship possible, and turn it toward confusion and despair and the systematic reduction of a person to the worst version of what they could be. Morgoth being precise, understanding that the most elegant corruption of a gift is not to destroy it but to make it serve its opposite purpose. Smaug is the greatest conversationalist in the literature of the Third Age. The scene in his hall in the dark, with Bilbo standing invisible and frightened and thinking faster than he has ever thought in his comfortable hobbit life, that is a masterclass in dialogue between radically unequal parties, in the management of information under conditions of total threat, in the way a quick and frightened mind navigates against a mind that is playing a game and does not yet understand that the smaller player is running a different game simultaneously. Smaug talks beautifully, with a specific pride and a specific humor and a quality of theatrical self-enjoyment that is simultaneously magnificent and quietly terrifying. He likes the conversation. That is the most unsettling thing about it. He is not interrogating, not extracting information under pressure. He is performing for an audience of one in the dark, with the complete and settled understanding that he can end the performance whenever he chooses and in whatever manner he prefers. That's what he believes anyway. He appears in the records of the Third Age in the year 2770. He comes from the north. From somewhere in the vast wilderness beyond the settled lands, wherever it is that dragons lie dormant when they have no hoard worth keeping and no enemy worth the effort. He is old when he comes. Old by dragon standards, which means his intelligence has reached the depth that only centuries of uninterrupted thought can produce, and whatever was not yet formed in him has had time to crystallize into the specific and complete thing that he is when he arrives. He descends on Erebor on an autumn afternoon. The dwarves of Thror's line were at the height of their prosperity, Erebor in full production, Dale thriving, the trade routes active. The kingdom under the mountain was exactly what it had been built to be, the center of dwarven culture in the Third Age, the place where the craft tradition of Durin's folk had reached its fullest expression. Smaug came from the north, not as a distant threat approaching, as an event already in progress. Fire before warning, scale before comprehension. The accounts describe him as moving at a speed that didn't permit the kind of preparation that warnings are supposed to allow for. He was asterisk there before it was fully real that he was coming. Dale burned, Erebor's gates were breached. Those who didn't flee in the first moments died in them. Those who fled carried only their lives and not all of those. Smaug settled into the mountain, arranged himself on the accumulated wealth of a civilization that had spent centuries building it, and lay there for 171 years. In that time, Dale rebuilt as a smaller, poorer city. The dwarves scattered. The world continued. Events happened. The long processes of the Third Age continued their movement toward the gathering darkness that Gandalf and others could feel coming but not yet see clearly. Smaug breathed. He ran the census of the Horde, thought his long, slow thoughts about himself and his magnificence and the dwarves who were somewhere to the northwest and who he expected would eventually attempt something. Not with urgency, not with the anxiety of something that feels threatened, with the settled, patient attention of something that knows it is the most dangerous creature for 10,000 miles in any direction and can afford to wait as long as waiting takes. When Bilbo came, the burglar sent by a wizard accompanying 13 dwarves with a plan that Smaug would have dismissed as inadequate if he'd understood it fully, Smaug was ready in the only sense that mattered. Not ready for the specific threat. Ready in the general sense of being completely what he was, fully capable, entirely certain. The conversation in the dark is everything. Bilbo was functionally terrified in the specific way that someone is terrified when they're standing in a room with the most dangerous thing in the world, and their only protection is a magic ring that makes them invisible and a natural gift for saying things that are technically true without quite saying what they mean. He riddled. He flattered. He managed the information he was extracting, the location of the bare patch on Smaug's chest, with the care of someone who knows that saying the wrong thing ends everything immediately. Smaug enjoyed it. After 171 years of silence, anything that talked back was interesting. He didn't register the specific danger of what the conversation was doing. Why would he? He had no bare patch in his certainty that corresponded to the bare patch in his armor. He'd examined himself for weaknesses and found none. He showed Bilbo the armor to demonstrate its perfection, and in doing so revealed the one place where perfection was incomplete, because the completeness had never been verified, because certainty that it was complete had substituted for the verification. Bard's arrow found the place. A black arrow, last of a line inherited through generations of his family, kept against some future need that his ancestors perhaps couldn't have named but felt as a responsibility. A thrush, one of those ancient, perceptive birds Tolkien places at the margins of great events as quiet witnesses who turn out to matter enormously, had been at a vent in the mountain. Overheard Bilbo describing the patch to Balin. The thrush flew to Bard, spoke to him in the way those birds speak to men who come from lines that know how to listen, told him where to place the arrow. Smaug came over the long lake in fire and fury, burning Laketown, executing the revenge his stolen cup demanded. And Bard's arrow, shot in the dark from the ruins of a burning city, found the gap. Smaug fell into the lake. The fire went out. He was the last of his kind. After Smaug there are no more great fire drakes. The tradition Morgoth had developed across the entire First Age that had persisted in Smaug alone through the long centuries of the Third ended with him. The cold drakes of the Grey Mountains persist in diminished form. But the era of Glaurung and Ankalagan and Smaug, the era of the magnificent, fire-breathing, civilization-ending intelligence, was over. He was the last chapter of an older book. The armor of a mature fire drake is real, not legend, not the product of fear in the people who describe it. The hide of a dragon of Smaug's age resists cutting, resists blunt force at a scale that renders meaningless any weapon Third Age armies could bring. The combination of scale, hide, and the thermal properties of a creature that generates its own fire internally makes the dragon effectively impenetrable by ordinary means. Tolkien was precise about the exceptions, and precise about why they existed. Glaurung was killed by a sword thrust to his belly, not his armored back, his underside, where the armoring is thinnest because it wasn't the primary surface against which attacks were designed. Turin stabbed upward from below while Glaurung was stretched across a ravine, and the wound was mortal because it reached something the external armor hadn't protected. Smaug's vulnerability was the bare patch, a gap in the scale on his chest, where the armor had either never grown properly or had been worn away by long contact with rough gold over 171 years of lying on it. A natural imperfection in a construction that was otherwise extraordinarily complete. The kind of thing that a creature whose perfection was self-assessed rather than externally verified would not have found. because the certainty of completeness had preempted the inspection. In both cases, the dragon was not killed by being outfought. In both cases, the dragon was killed by specific asterisk knowledge, precisely located, specifically detailed knowledge of a single point of vulnerability in a creature that was otherwise beyond any available weapon. And in both cases, the knowledge was provided by the dragon. Glaurung's belly was exposed because of where he chose to rest. Smaug's bare patch was revealed because he showed it not to expose the weakness, but to perform the armor's completeness for an audience he decided was too small to threaten him. The weakness is adjacent to the pride. Not metaphorically, structurally. The same quality that makes the dragon dangerous, the settled, unchallengeable certainty of its own magnificence, is the quality that prevents it from examining itself from the outside, from conducting the honest, vulnerable self-assessment that might find the flaw. The certainty substitutes for the verification. The verification is never done. And the flaw waits patient as the dragon itself, for the creature small enough that the dragon doesn't worry about showing it everything. Tolkien knew this pattern from the Norse sources he'd spent his career inside. The great beast's vulnerability is always adjacent to its greatest strength. The hero doesn't win by being more powerful. The hero wins by knowing something. What they know is usually something the beast told them, because the beast was too large and too certain to imagine that anything it revealed could be turned against it. This is not a simple lesson about the danger of pride. It's a lesson about the specific epistemic risk of certainty so complete that it forecloses the self-examination that certainty actually requires to be justified. Tolkien was not working with dragons casually. He was not borrowing a convenient monster from the fantasy tradition and giving it new trappings. He was doing what he did with everything in his mythology, inheriting a tradition he understood from the inside, understood at the depth that comes from decades of scholarly engagement with original sources, and transforming it into something that was simultaneously authentically in that tradition and entirely his own. Fafnir in the Völsunga saga is Glaurung's primary ancestor. Fafnir was originally a being of near-human nature who became a dragon through his own avarice, through the specific corruption of a cursed horde that transformed what he was into something that served the horde's demands. Tolkien took the cursed horde, the dragon's intelligence and the vulnerability of the underbelly, and transposed them into a mythology that grounded them differently but preserved their essential truth. The dragon in Beowulf is the other ancestor. Tolkien wrote about this creature at length in his famous lecture, and what he said about it reveals what he was building in his own dragons. The Beowulf dragon, he argued, is not a metaphor, not an allegory for something else. It is a dragon, real in the sense that matters, which is the sense of being real within the world the story creates. Its function is not to represent evil abstractly, but to be the specific opponent that makes the specific qualities of the specific hero legible. You understand what Beowulf is by seeing what he faces. Tolkien carried this understanding into his own mythology with full intention. The greatness of the First Age heroes is legible in the fact that they faced Glaurung and some survived it. The specific quality of Bilbo's courage, small, unheroic, deeply ordinary courage that doesn't announce itself as courage, that operates through cleverness and understatement and the genuine willingness to be terrified and keep going, is legible precisely because he sat in the dark with Smaug and held a conversation without losing his nerve. You understand what Bilbo is by seeing what he faced. You understand what he faced by understanding what the dragon was. The scholarly love and the storyteller's understanding work together in Tolkien's dragon lore to produce creatures that are simultaneously mythologically authentic, doing what dragons in the tradition do, resonating with their literary ancestors, and genuinely new. Glaurung is not Fafnir. Smaug is not the Beowulf dragon. They inherit the tradition and transform it into something that belongs specifically to Middle-earth's theology, its specific understanding of what evil is, how it works, and what it asks of those who must face it. There is a specific relationship between dragons and dwarves in Tolkien's world that goes considerably deeper than the surface narrative of dragon steals treasure and dwarf wants it back. Dwarves were made by Alla the smith, who loved craft and mineral things and the deep architecture of stone. They were made to work in the earth, to understand metal and rock, to produce from the raw material of the world things of beauty and complexity and use. The craft tradition of the dwarves is not incidental to what they are. It is the asterisk form their being takes. Dragons were made by Morgoth, who corrupted Allah's work along with everything else he could reach. The connection is not coincidental. What the dragon wants, gold, gems, the work things of the earth, is precisely what the dwarf makes, not generically, specifically. The hoard a dragon accumulates is the output of dwarven civilization, taken out of its context and asterisk reduced. The work cup, the carved stone, the intricate inlay of mithril and iron representing generations of accumulated craft knowledge in the dragon's hoard, all of that becomes just gold, just weight, just the substrate of a creature's self-image. Smaug does not melt down the cups and ornaments and carved stonework. He lies on them. They are beneath him, literally. The apex of a civilization's creative output has become bedroom furniture for a creature that doesn't understand what it means and doesn't need to. The humiliation is structural, not intentional. Dragons are not moved by the desire to humiliate, but the relationship between what was made and what now uses it as a sleeping surface is inherently a statement about what the making was worth. The statement is nothing except as a comfortable surface asterisk. The dwarven quest to reclaim Erebor is, at this level, a quest to restore meaning to things that have had their meaning taken from them. The gold matters not primarily because gold has value. It matters because those objects in that place represent what the dwarves were and could be again. The dragon lying on them is the specific form of desecration that prevents the restoration. When Smaug is dead and the treasure is reclaimed and the battle of 5 armies ends and the dwarves rebuild, when Erebor becomes Erebor again and Dale is reborn, Tolkien gives back something more than a kingdom. He gives back the thing the kingdom was for. The gold goes back into circulation. The work things return to use. The craft objects become what they were made to be rather than what a dragon's presence had reduced them to. Here is the deepest thing. Below the mythology and the scholarship and the specific craft of making particular creatures work in particular narratives, below all of it, Tolkien was building the most complete image in his entire legendarium of what absolute evil looks like when it is functioning at full capacity. And when it is beautiful asterisk. That's the thing I named at the beginning and have been building toward through everything since. Dragons are not ugly, not grotesque. They don't produce the visceral physical repulsion that keeps you at a distance from an orc. Tolkien insisted on their magnificence. He loved them in the specific unsettled way of someone who has spent enough time with a subject to see all its angles. He gave them grandeur and eloquence and intelligence and a terrible beauty that comes from being perfectly, completely designed for a particular purpose. The purpose is destruction. And the magnificence and the destruction are not separable. The beauty and the evil are the same thing. To admire the dragon is to admire the thing that kills cities. There is no version of the dragon that keeps the grandeur and removes the harm. The grandeur is the harm. It is the grandeur that makes the harm this particular, devastating, civilization-ending kind rather than the ordinary destruction of a less sophisticated weapon. Orcs are what happens when something good is broken and twisted into something that produces harm. The corruption is visible in their form, they are degraded from what they were. Dragons are different. Dragons are what happens when Morgoth applies his full intelligence and his full creative energy, corrupted creative energy, yes, the warped version of the creativity he could never truly possess, and makes something that is not broken, something that works, something entirely and completely what it was designed to be with no gap between the design and the execution, no visible corruption in its form because the form is the intention expressed perfectly. And what he designed them to be is the most efficient possible agent of destruction and psychological ruin that an intelligence of his order could conceive. Orcs are Morgoth's corruption. Dragons are Morgoth's achievement, dark achievement, evil achievement, achievement in full service of the worst intention in the world, but achievement nonetheless. Tolkien was not making a cynical argument that beauty implies evil or that intelligence is inherently dangerous or that magnificence is suspicious. He was making an argument more exact and more uncomfortable than that. He was saying, the presence of beauty and intelligence and magnificence does not guarantee goodness. A thing can be everything it was made to be, perfectly designed and perfectly executed and magnificent in every accessible quality, and it can still be a catastrophe. The quality of the making is not the same thing as the righteousness of the purpose. The intention behind the making matters just as much and cannot be read from the beauty of the product. Glaurung was perfectly made. Enkelhagen was perfectly made. Smaug was perfectly made. Each was exactly what Morgoth designed. And what Morgoth designed was the most complete possible expression of his understanding of destruction. Not crude, not ugly, not the simple breaking of things, but intelligent, patient, precise, capable of conversation and strategy and the long game, capable of destroying not just bodies but the stories people tell themselves, the civilizations they build, the meanings they make. Tolkien wrote dragons before the legendarium. Chrysophylax dives in Farmer Giles of Ham** is a comic dragon, cowardly, posturing, immediately retreating when facing genuine opposition. Tolkien wrote it with obvious delight, the same love of the creature that's in everything else he wrote about dragons but expressed as comedy, the vanity becoming absurd, the pride becoming laughable. And then he wrote Glaurung. The same mind, the same scholar's familiarity with the tradition, the same deep feeling for what dragons are. But making something that is not comic in any sense, something precisely, comprehensively terrible. Both were possible from the same understanding. What does that mean? It means Tolkien understood dragons the way you understand something you've lived inside long enough to see all its angles at once. He saw the comedy in them, the vanity so total that it circles back around to absurdity, the pride that cannot imagine a world that does not organize itself around the dragon's assessment of its own importance. The specific ridiculousness of something so certain of its invulnerability that it never considers the possibility that anything it reveals can be used against it. He also saw the tragedy not in the dragons, who don't experience tragedy the way beings capable of regret do, but in what the dragons do to the people around them. Turin, broken by Glaurung's precision. The dwarves, driven from what they'd built. Laketown, burning in the dark because a thief came to a mountain and a dragon woke. The dragon is Tolkien's image of evil that is too large for heroism to simply overcome. You cannot be brave enough, you cannot be skilled enough. Glaurung required Turin's courage and Turin's skill, and it still cost Turin everything. Smaug required Bilbo's cleverness and Bard's skill and a thrush that happened to be paying attention, and it still burned a city before it was over. Ankalagan required Arendelle with a Silmaril and the full mobilization of the Eagles of Manwë, and it still lasted a night and a day. The dragon makes you see what you are actually up against. And what you are up against in Tolkien's mythology is never something that can be defeated by any single quality, however developed. It requires convergence, the right person with the right knowledge at the right moment, a thrush that was listening when it shouldn't have been, an inheritance of black arrows kept through generations against a need no one could have named. The weakness is adjacent to the pride. The information comes through the dragon's own need for an audience. The gap in the armor exists because certainty that there was no gap prevented the inspection. And only something very small and very frightened and very attentive and entirely beneath the dragon's concern as a threat will ever be in a position to see it. Part 16: The Last Fire. Smaug fell into the Long Lake in the autumn of 2941 of the Third Age. He fell in fire as he had come, and where he hit the water the lake burned briefly and then went dark. The most dangerous creature in the Third Age, the last living expression of Morgoth's full achievement in dragon-making, was gone. The Third Age continued for 78 more years. The War of the Ring was fought and won. The One Ring was destroyed. The Age of Men began, and through all of it the burning of the Shire, the breaking of the Fellowship, Helm's Deep, Minas Tirith, the Black Gate, not one dragon, not one great fire drake. The last fire of the Elder Days went into the Long Lake with Smaug. The stories of Glaurung and Ankalagan and Smaug became what all true stories eventually become: legend. Verified memory turned into passed-down account. Passed-down account turned into fireside tale. Fireside tale turned into the kind of story you tell children who have never seen a dragon and will not need to prepare for one. Tolkien, who had spent his academic life in the literature of peoples for whom these things were not legend but history, who had sat with the Beowulf dragon and the Norse fireworm and the cursed gold of the Völsung cycle long enough to understand what was real in them beneath the legend, put the dragons back. Not as fantasy decoration, not as plot obstacles, not as monsters of convenient narrative danger. As memory. As his attempt to restore to these creatures the full scale they actually had. To make people sitting in comfortable houses feel, for a moment, what it would have meant to see Smaug descend on Dale, to be in the dark with Glaurung's eyes finding you, to stand under the shadow of Ankalagan's wings. He did it because the tradition was worth honoring, because the knowledge was worth preserving, because these creatures were too important as images of a specific and necessary truth about evil, about what evil looks like when it is beautiful and intelligent and perfectly made and completely serious, to be left in the simplified form that time and distance and the comfort of forgetting had reduced them to. Coda: What waits in the north? Somewhere in the gray mountains, in cold passes the dwarves abandoned and have not returned to, cold drakes still move. Smaller than what they were, diminished from the elder days, without fire, without names that echo through ages, but there, old, patient, still thinking their slow, long thoughts in the way creatures think when they measure time in centuries. The age that could produce another Smaug is gone. The conditions that made those creatures possible, the sustained, directed, intelligent application of Morgoth's full power, ended with the first age and cannot be recovered, because Morgoth is gone and what he took with him into the void includes the specific capacity that made his dragons what they were. But the asterisk thing those creatures expressed, the capacity of magnificent intelligence directed without remainder toward destruction, beauty and terror not separable in the same form, the patience of something that measures time in centuries while you measure it in years, that is not gone. It does not go. Tolkien didn't give the dragons a clean extinction, he gave them a diminishment and a persistence. He left cold drakes in the northern passes, he left the tradition alive even if broken. He gave the world an implicit understanding that what the dragon's asterisk meant, the specific truth about evil they embodied, was not something that ended when the last great fire went out. It reduces, it quiets, it waits. And the age that forgets it entirely is the age that will eventually find it has not, in return, been forgot. The fire in the north is patient. The darkness beyond it is older than any name we have given it. And patience in a creature that measures its life in centuries is not a quality. It is a nature.